Welcome to Cuba Communist Threat, the webinar series by Victims of Communist Memorial Foundation. In the name of Victims of Communist Memorial Foundation, I'm an honor to be here with you and to having this special time to share some information about the threats from the communist regime in Cuba and how this regime has been manipulating the information and how this regime has been exporting the repression, exporting the bad practice, the violation of human rights, and how the regime not only operates in Latin America, in the cases like Venezuela, and also in Africa and other regions, and how the regime has been using a supposedly humanitarian mission, medical mission, to obtain profit, exploiting the Cuban doctors and also using this as part of human trafficking. Thank you for being here. Today we have the honor of having an expert, well-known expert in terms of security, in terms of Cuba, in combating counterterrorists. Is Hugo Acha. Is in the International Fellow for the Bolivia at the Center for a Secure Free Society. He's also the Director of Research and Outreach for the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba. He has been lecturing about counterterrorism and combating transnational organized crime in different universities here in the US and in Latin America. He's a lawyer from Bolivia. He has been persecuted by these regimes because of his position against authoritarian regimes. And also, he has on different courses in different places, and also a master's degree in security, defense, and development in Bolivia. And of course, he has been also participating in different research, and he has been actively engaged in a research to expose the terrible program that the Cuban regime has been implementing for several decades in total impunity. So with you today, Hugo, extraordinary guy, and thanks to him, some of these cases right now are under major exposure, and the regime is concerned because we have researchers like Hugo. Hugo, the program is yours.
Thank you, Carlos. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to share this space and this time with you and with everybody that has joined us in this occasion. It is good in order to start to understand all these aspects that you have mentioned, to provide a little bit of context. And this entire thing has to do with totalitarianism and communism. Why am I saying this? In 1949, the Soviet Union realized that its main enemy, the main obstacle to prevail, to this ideology to prevail in a global scale, was the United States of America. So the premiership of the Politburo requested a report to every single intelligence agency in the Soviet Union. And the question was simple: in which scenario can the Soviet Union prevail in an open confrontation against the United States of America? The answer provided by the KGB and the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Agency, was devastating for the top level of the Politburo. The answer was, there is no scenario in which, in a formal confrontation, we can prevail against the United States of America. The might of the industrial capabilities of the United States, the might of the American economy are too big to overcome. We are not a fully industrialized society. Our technological development, even being mighty, cannot compare to these abilities and the proportion of these abilities that America has. So the next question in typical Soviet pragmatism was like, okay, if we cannot prevail in an open confrontation, how can we win against the United States? And the answer was, there are only three ways in which we can prevail. First, the only thing that you can compare in terms of economy against the might of the United States economy is the illicit circuit in a global scale. We need to infiltrate, control, and lead the cycle of the illicit economic circuit if we want to have a prayer against the United States. Second, we need to master hybrid warfare, mainly terrorism, because this is the only way in which we can confront the US using proxies on the military field in order to prevail against the US. And finally, we need to destroy the US from the principal front. We need to prevail in the war of ideas. We need to infiltrate the academia. Very interestingly, the first and second fields were entrusted to the GRU. The third one was entrusted to the KGB. Every single thing that I'm telling you, it's already in open sources, has been published. It's all fact-based and can be, fact-checked. Why this is important for us? Because three foreign intelligence services allied to the Soviets were selected to be the partners in developing these initiatives. The Czech intelligence service, the Communist Germany intelligence services, and the Cuban intelligence services. So they were brought on board, they were trained, and they became as capable, if not better, than the Soviet services in doing this. This is the beginning, this is the genesis on Cuba's formal participation in the transnational organized crime arena as part of its integral strategy to deal in its perpetual, perennial war against the United States and against democracy. There is a precedent. During the campaign of Sierra Maestra, Fidel Castro taxed the producers of marijuana in order to fund the guerrilla movement. So he was no strange to reaching out to the illicit thing in order to fuel the ideological war. This has a very well documented history. The most important one is related to drug trafficking. There is a book I recommend to everybody. It's called My Life with the Cocaine King. It's authored by Aida Levy, Viuda de Suarez. She is the wife of the late one and only cocaine kingpin at a global scale, Roberto Suarez, a Bolivian national who organized a criminal enterprise called La Corporación. This is the forerunner of the cartels. Actually, the cartels, the much vaunted Colombian cartels, were divisions of La Corporación. They were actually organized. Pablo Escobar, Leder, Rodriguez Gacha, all of them were recruited by Suarez. And this is where things become very interesting. In this book, in this matches the testimonies of very relevant Cuban defectors, Fidel Castro himself cut a deal with Suarez, providing cover and protection for cocaine trafficking in exchange for a participation in this business. Fidel Castro understood immediately that this was a weapon of strategic proportions. He even says that. He's quoted there saying, "This is what I need in order to defeat the Americans. This is what I need to breach the blockade. This is what I need to prevail." Later on, Suarez vanished from the scene. The Colombian cartels took over, and this alliance continued. The alliance was reflected in the relationship between the Cuban dictatorship and the FARC, the Cuban dictatorship and all these quote unquote liberation movements in Central America that were basically being bankrolled by the illicit. Once the Cold War was over and Venezuela, in this case, Hugo Chavez, came to the rescue, it was not enough with the cycle of the formal and legal economy of oil to provide for all the strategic purposes of the Cuban dictatorship. So they persuaded Chavez that the legal side of the Venezuelan economy, namely oil, was the ideal way to provide a cover for the proceedings of the illicit activities. At the same time, they also discovered, we're talking about late 60s, that exporting people was even more convenient than drug trafficking. It was something that could be disguised as solidarity missions, it could be disguised as cooperation, or it could be even disguised as volunteers going to fight for freedom. There is solid evidence, for example, that for each soldier that Castro sent to fight in Angola alongside UNITA, Cuban regime was receiving the equivalent at that time of $1,000 per soldier. Don't trust me, it is in documents, in books. There is a very good book by Pedre Penton that describes that in detail. I highly recommend that book too. Finally, they also discovered that soldiers were good to generate profit, but doctors were even better. Because a guy clad in a green uniform can be very persuasive, but bottom line, he is a symbol of force. A person dressed in white is extremely well received. It's going to cover very needed necessities for every society in the world, not only developing countries, not only poor countries. You can use this as a diplomatic tool. You can use this as a way to generate profit. What is the result today? The much vaunted Cuban medical missions that are disseminated all around the world as the main example of non-for-profit solidarity by a country that is taking care of the poor and the downtrodden are nothing but the largest, biggest, most profitable scheme of human trafficking and treatment akin to slavery in the history of the world. We are talking about tens of thousands of persons treated as merchandise. They are treated as exporting goods. And they are producing, as we speak, 50.3% of the net income in foreign currency that the regime is receiving. Again, don't trust me. You can check this and you are going to find statements made by Cuban officials belonging to the Ministerio de la Salud, to the Ministerio de Economía, to the Ministerio, even to people belonging to the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias, that are basically bragging about the results and the income that is generated by the Cuban medical missions. What is the truth behind the Cuban medical missions? First and foremost, we need to understand that they are not non-for-profit, they are not solidarity-based, they are not volunteered, and they do not produce any kind of benefit for the Cuban people, okay? The export of this have resulted in a deterioration of the quality of healthcare inside of the island, and the money that is produced never reaches the Cuban people. Let me explain that. As per, again, public statements made by Cuban officials, the amount that has been gathered by the Cuban dictatorship has never been below $6.3 billion a year. At some point, it have reached, in their own statements and declarations, up to $11.4 billion in revenue. When you ask the local population if by any way, shape, or form this has impacted in a positive way the infrastructure, the equipment, the quality of the healthcare attention inside of the island, which, by the way, is the justification that they always use when questioned about the Cuban medical missions, the answer of the local population in Cuba, and we have fact-checked that too through the Foundation for Human Rights in Cuba, is that if anything, the worsening of the healthcare attention quality in the island is at its lowest point ever. What is the destiny? What is the final point of destination of all this money? That is a mystery, because here is where, again, the lack of transparency provides another very, very interesting tool for the regime. Since nobody can actually fact check these numbers, sometimes it's kind of hard to fathom how efficient this entire scheme is, not only as a way to get money, but to use that money, that it is the product of a quote-unquote legal activity, for money laundering. Because this is another surprising thing. A lot of these companies, we're talking about like 85 companies that are providing these so-called medical services, are actually then partnering in activities that have nothing to do with healthcare. They are partnering in urban development, in the construction of big hotels. They are even participating as stockholders in companies outside of Cuba. So it's a very interesting thing, but it's very hard to trace because there is no way, again, to fact check the numbers. There is no way to confirm. They are saying, yeah, we have gathered, let's take the numbers from 2016, okay, 8.3 billion for this concept. Where did those 8.3 billion go? It's impossible to check. They never went to improve, again, the healthcare system or the medical attention to Cubans in Cuba. And here is the final thought on this. There is another darker side. Can you imagine what I'm saying? Even darker than the human rights violations that are actually inflicted upon the Cuban doctors that are forced to participate in these missions, deprived of their documents, deprived of their academic credentials, having their families basically taken as hostages, being forced to survive in very precarious conditions. Yes, there is a darker side. There is a double human rights violation. The Cuban doctors are also used at the same time as cover for paramilitary intelligence and counterintelligence operatives that use the guise of medical doctors to wreak havoc in Latin America, Africa, and other places. They are propaganda agents. They are sometimes engaged in active measures, sometimes violent measures, and these have also been well documented. One final thing that's even worse. One effect that has not been properly exposed yet. The Cuban doctors are forced, coerced, under duress to falsify medical statistics. And this is a crime that goes very, very far in time. Because when you are falsifying medical stats, you are forced to say that you saw a number of patients that you never actually checked. You are saying that you are treating a large number of diseases, some of them endemic in the regions where these missions are present. And you're saying that you're treating that only to justify the regime to have a demand for pharmaceutical products, for services, and other type of commercial activities. You are actually harming the safety and security of the entire nation where your mission is. Because when you're saying that, international organizations, some of which have been deeply penetrated and sometimes used as tools for these corrupt activities by the Cuban regime, take that data and then they assume that entire regions are disease-free. Entire regions have received the proper and by-the-book level of treatment, and that is a huge lie. The consequences of this, if right now, when we are facing the consequences of one state, in this case China, withholding and hiding proper information, and lying about medical stats. The result, as we all know, is the COVID-19 pandemic. We need to brace ourselves, because another huge effect of these illicit activities that have profit as its only goal has been also to damage in a very significant way the healthcare policies in the Americas and everywhere these Cuban medical missions went.
Thank you, Hugo. It's amazing. It's another side of the story based on security, based on of the corrupt regime. They also has been penetrating all the intelligence community in those countries. Cases like Venezuela, and the Cubans manage all the security. They are behind. They are not in the middle. They are not the ones that torture, but they are the ones that train the torturers. They are the ones that are behind all the crime. They don't get involved. When I hear about Nicaragua, Venezuela, they say they hear Cubans, they're torturing them. I don't think so. I believe there's more the Cubans training the forces, because they don't get involved in that. They are coordinating the whole operation. And you are saying also that the Cuban regime has been behind a whole scheme of spies, also manipulating the security of all these countries. So we can say that all these medical humanitarian missions also have some elements of the Cuban regime using their spy, the intelligence staff people to go to the country, like what happened in Bolivia or Ecuador, that they found that for each doctor, probably there were 2 or more non-doctors in that mission and not support team. How that operate?
Well, you're absolutely right. And it's actually very, very concerning. First, when we are talking, and you mentioned that international organizations, you are absolutely aware that there is the case of the Pan American Health Organization that was used basically willingly. I have to say willingly, and this is not a personal statement. We have the documents, the emails, the cables, the communications between the Pan American Health Organization officials, Cuban high-ranking officials, and members of the Dilma Rousseff government discussing openly 1 year before the Cuban component of the Mais Médicos program came to fruition, how to break international law, including human rights conventions, how to breach federal law in Brazil, the Brazilian Constitution, US federal law, and also to use the Pan American Health Organization bank accounts to funnel this money in an illegal way to the Cuban regime. Another thing that was very concerning is that we had...
And charging a commission to the Pan American Health Organization.
They were getting 5%. 5%. They were retaining 5%. That, by the way, it is a myth that was to cover certain expenses because they were paying for the transportation and the lodging of the doctors at a local level. That is a lie. We have documents showing that if you were part of a local government and you wanted Cuban doctors in your municipio, you were supposed to commit local resources to cover every single expense. So that's also false.
No, we have the contract from Uruguay, from Mexico, from Ecuador and Bolivia, and the local government or the national government, or the government of those countries, were the one they cover all the expenditures, tickets, accommodation, food, everything, plus the money that they need to pay to the Cuban regime.
The last cent. But to your point, the most concerning part is that in Brazil, that is a very serious country in terms of institutions, we have video and audio of PAHO's officials discussing how the Brazilians were told to provide visas to foreign intelligence operatives, Cuban G2 members, as doctors, knowingly, not only to provide security and surveillance to avoid defections within the Cuban medical mission contingent, but also to help in the ideological and propaganda agenda of the PT government. And all of that, again, is documented. It's not just me saying, I think, I heard. No, no, no. We have been able to watch the videos. We have been able to see the transcripts and hear the audios. So all of this is very, very well documented. You mentioned Bolivia. In Bolivia, the situation was even worse. Out of a contingent at the last point of Evo Morales' dictatorship, you had officially more than 725 Cuban doctors as per Morales' regime. When the dust cleared, when Morales was out of power, and the documents were found inside a security house. They were not inside of the Cuban embassy. No, 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 at a security house with a bunker. What in the world is a security house with a bunker doing hosting a medical mission? They found the credentials and documents of the alleged doctors. And it was shocking to know that barely a little more over 200 were actual medical personnel. So you had 500 people who God only knows, you can assume, what type of field of expertise they had. Why am I saying this? Because 4 of them were caught red-handed in La Paz, giving money to rioters to create violence against the transitional government. So that is just one example, again, well documented, on what the true nature of these missions are. And let me be very precise again. The doctors are victims. They are the victims. They have their human rights violated because they are trafficked and abused. And then they have a double violation when they are forced to do these things and provide cover for nefarious activities.
That's something that we need to ask to the supporters of these missions, people that are here in the U.S. that want to promote them from a Nobel Prize, if they are willing to allow the U.S. government to retain 90% of their salaries and then use their money in corruption and whatever the regime wanted and not benefit anyone. If any one of the ones that are promoting this missions for the Nobel Prize is willing to do that, let us know and they can give us some of their money and we can do something better with that. So one of the questions from the audience is are there spies or secret police dressed as health workers practicing medicine without a license? But because we know right now as a fact, Peru, the mission that arrived to Peru, they don't have any training for ER, any training to work with the respirators, and they are supposedly working to save life from the COVID-19. And we hear the same thing from several doctors. Maybe they don't have any clue about ER, or some doctors that are traumatologists and working as another thing different. That so how is this work? Are they dressed as police? There are some members of the security forces, Cuban security forces, practicing as doctor without a license.
That's an excellent question. Let the New York Times answer. There was a very extensive article published by the New York Times. You cannot accuse the New York Times of being, an outlet that's pandering to the far right or the Cuban Miami mafia, or all the epithets that are usually levied against anybody that is questioning this. The New York Times published an extensive investigative report that established solidly that Cuban intelligence operatives were embedded in the missions. When needed, they were dressed as doctors, and sometimes when the operation demanded that, they were even providing medical services without being medical personnel. So the answer is no, they have nothing that allow you to tell them apart. They are officially considered. Remember what I mentioned about the Brazilian case? That conversation, and I quote, said, You need to provide these people who are not doctors with medical visas. You need to consider them as medical personnel, and you will treat them as if they were doctors, even knowing that they were intelligence and security operatives.
So we are talking of impersonation of doctors. We're talking about security forces spying the countries. We're also talking about malpractice too, because you have people that are not prepared, even though they are victims here. The regime forced them to lie, also to engage in false medical procedures. They feel false claims. So this is just a major charade by the regime. It is what is happening here.
I think it is a bigger crime than just human rights violations. And I say this as a person that is committed to the defense of human rights, as a human rights activist. Listen carefully. This is even worse, because on top of a human rights violation, you are endangering the health and security of entire societies for profit. So it's even worse than just, and it's hard for me to say just, human rights violations.
And why? Okay, we can think about Brazil 10 years ago, just pure ideological thing to support their friend of the regime, Fidel Castro and the regime. We can envision that Venezuela, Hugo Chavez exporting and supporting the Cuban to export this mission to Bolivia and Nicaragua. And that was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Then no one had a clue about the reality behind that. But right now, the governments from Italy, from Argentina, from Peru, from Mexico, they are actually opening their borders to bring these doctors, or the government of Canada that's paying the bill, and some, or the government of Norway, they're paying the bill for the doctors that go to Haiti. After we have all this proof, after we have all these documents, and also not only from experts like you, from the doctors that has been talking about that. Why this government continue supporting a program like this?
Well, Carlos, I am a strong believer that you need to abide by a higher standard. I believe in moral imperatives. So I think the answer to your question has three levels. The first one, are you morally in agreement with a scheme that has already been exposed as human trafficking and treatment akin to slavery? That's the first question we need to ask to Cinque Stelle in Italy. We need to ask to the government of countries like Andorra, because, you know, you can understand the position of Podemos in Spain. They are far left, they are hell-bent into an ideological confrontation, and they think that all of this is justified as another form of the struggle in the Marxist-Leninist conception of the world. But Italy? Let's ask the second question. Are you willing to risk things that are far bigger than ideological affinity, like the case of Mexico? Let me quote this. There is a free trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. It's been already ratified. By the way, in just a couple of weeks, it's going to be regulated to the detail in Mexico. This treaty states that none of the parties of this treaty can engage in any way, shape, or form in human trafficking or treatment akin to slavery as defined by the International Labor Organization, or the benefits of this treaty would be immediately suspended. Is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is about to come and visit the President of the United States, who knows that right now in the middle of this pandemic, has his economy dependent on this free trade agreement, willing to risk the economic stability and the future of Mexico just to allow this to happen? That's another question worth asking. And the final one, are you, any of these countries, any of these organizations supporting that, willing to continue to pretend you believe the charade when you have seen evidence that what is going on under the surface is actually the insertion of people that are able to create conflict, wreak havoc, to ignite processes that can go from an uprising to a civil war, just in the name of, again, ideological affinity. I think that is the full concept of the answer that your question needs to provide.
It will be really hard for Andrés Manuel López Obrador after the human trafficking, the trafficking person report, and after all the information that has been around, to deny the reality behind this mission and that these missions are human trafficking, human rights violations. So what you say probably has a major implication. That it's a time to review the role in this agreement of Mexico, and as one of the lawyers sent a letter to the government of Mexico, one of the U.S. lawyer, that telling them, hey, listen, you're probably violating the law. So they have been aware of that, and probably they need to face the consequences. So do you think that there is a way for putting pressure to the Mexican government to stop this contribution to a terrible regime, but also to end the exploitation and human trafficking?
Carlos, you know me, I am a person that always talks basing every single expression on facts. There's been an interview, it's been public, you can actually find it all over the internet, where the Secretary of Health of Mexico City, her name is Oliva de López Arellano. This lady, in this interview, states, first, this is a federal program. This was being denied by López Obrador. He was saying it was a local initiative, that it was something that Mexico City was doing, that it was part of an initiative that was christened as the COAPA initiative. Here you have the Secretary of Health of Mexico City, the capital of Mexico, saying this is a federal program. She also says we have no idea where the funds are coming from because it is the federal government that's paying for them. We do not know if, when, or how the Cuban medical doctors are being paid, because we know, check the interview, that the Mexican federal government has cut a deal and has a contract with some unit from the Cuban Ministry of Health. And finally, and more importantly, we have no saying on the placement of these medical personnel. For Christ's sake, this is not an opposer. This is not a person hell-bent in causing problems to López Obrador. This is a close ally to the Mexican government, a person of trust to the president himself, who is basically saying that the federal government of Mexico is in breach, with full knowledge, of the treaty that is basically today the lifeline for the Mexican economy. So I think that is a valid question, and I think the answer lays, under this statement.
What about, there's another question. What about MEDIC, or Oakland, California, Latin American School of Medicine? There are some medical journals like Lancet and others that promote organizations like MEDIC, organizations that actually support this medical programs. What is the role of this?
Well, I think there is a need to believe. Okay, and in the US, I have seen a lot of this that is performing good faith. There's a lot of people in the medical field. I come from a family, my father is a doctor. I come from a family where we have doctors. I grew up around the medical field, okay? There was a myth that was very well built and construed by the Cuban propaganda about the excellence of the Cuban medicine. If there was some credence to that, that is a shadow. There is no quality, no essence of excellence, no more, okay? There is a point we are researching because we want to publish that in a point in time that I hope is going to be close, a report on when exactly the Cuban regime decided to cut all investment and development on high-level specialties to mass produce medical personnel at the fastest rate possible with the least effort possible to send them away in order to become money-making machines. So the thing here is that you have institutions and organizations like the ELAM, the Escuela Latinoamericana de Medicina, which is quoted by these organizations that you're mentioning. Do you, not you of course, but the people that are supporting this, know that a large part of the curriculum inside this organization is ideological indoctrination? That the solid core of medical science is reduced to a third, 2 years of what would be a regular course. Let's not talk about the United States of America. In Paraguay or Bolivia, where a full-fledged doctor needs to study for 7 years in order to get a license to practice basic medicine. So these are, again, questions that are worth posting, you know, because we need to have a serious discussion, devoid of any kind of ideological bias. These are facts. Why 86% of the doctors, Cuban doctors, and Chilean doctors educated in the ELAM fail the equivalence test in Santiago? That's unacceptable, okay? Why 83% of the Cuban doctors who tried to pass the equivalence test in Buenos Aires failed, when, for example, 72% of the Paraguayans, 76% of the Bolivians passed the same test? In theory, we're talking about Bolivia and Paraguay, two of the poorest countries in the region, and their professionally educated personnel has the proper credentials. That's a question worth asking.
No, it is terrible. I just want to know, sometimes figure it out, see some of the supporters of this in all these government are willing to go to these doctors and have treatment with this doctor. Probably they're gonna say no. We have another, well, there's something for us, for BOC, these videos, these videos are gonna be available, all of them in YouTube. There's a feature in YouTube that allows you to translate these videos and caption the videos in Spanish, but also what we want is to also take the best of each one of these videos with all the information, and we're gonna put together a documentary with all of our experts so we can share that in Cuba. That's good to promote us. So another question, what about Italy, an European country, and how this country, this is a question from Lorraine, how this country ignore the truth before about this medical mission? It's kind of the same that you already answered, but why Italy has been ignoring that?
Well, I think that alongside a lot of political phenomena that has been going on in the West, populism was something that we believed was not going to affect educated societies, advanced societies, okay? A lot of people, and I remember talking to Norwegian, Danish, Swedish representatives during the Constituent Assembly in Bolivia, and they were telling us, no, this would never happen to us. Guess what? It did, okay? Populism is extremely persuasive, and it can be on the right, it can be on the left, it has the same effect, okay? It's the lack of institutions, is the pervasive presence of corruption, and it is the conscious ignorance. Let me explain that. You choose to be ignorant about fulfilling the most basic obligations. Cinque Stelle was facing an existential crisis. They were showing the worst numbers in the world at that time. They needed to show they were doing something. So for them, it was not even a question to consider under an ethical light. There were doctors coming, they are Cuban, to hell with it. We need to show we are doing something, and they did. Later on, we learned that local medical personnel, Italian medical personnel, who are not interested in ideological or political agendas, said, the personnel that arrived, we are really grateful they came, but they are not proficient. We cannot allow them to go into the UTIs. We cannot let them go inside the ICUs. We cannot let them to operate because they don't have the proficiency. We are letting them, help the nurses, the clerical personnel, the administrative personnel. And when you check the list of what type of doctors were sent, in the case of Italy, in Cremona, for example, if I'm not mistaken, there was only one specialist, one. So again, I know we have already answered this, but I want to stress the point. It goes without saying that this is one of the maladies of populism.
And there are some things that you mentioned that I would just want to recall this because I don't want for us to lose track of the real nature of this. You're talking about the regime. It's supposed to be a communist regime, but a regime that have been creating this kind of programs as a way to receive more than 50% of the profit, not only by the program directly, 50%, but we have to remember that they also have some universities in Cuba training doctors from Guatemala, from Honduras, from Bolivia, from Uruguay in Cuba, charging those doctors, and also from Africa. There are some poor Africans there that has been suffering in Cuba. But well, this is a program for profit that also you mentioned that Cuba has been doing that for years. First with the militias or the military forces that the Cuban regime sent to Africa to make some profit with each one of them. Sexual workers that the Cuban regime has been exporting and also promoting in island for the Canadians and others that go to Cuba to do that kind of things. And also the trainers and so the Cuban regime is used to that. This is for profit. This is a business for the Cuban regime.
Oh yeah. The medical missions are just the flagship. Okay, they are just the tip of the iceberg. As you mentioned, the Cuban regime had no compunction of sending young Cubans to die in foreign battlefields that had nothing to do with Cuba. Okay, in the Ogaden, in Angola, Mozambique, there are even reports of Cuban military personnel fighting during the Yom Kippur War. I mean, there's credible reports of Cuban intelligence operatives performing tortures in American prisoners during the Vietnam War. And again, those are things that you can actually find. There have been object of congressional commissions and committees research. So it is a regime that considers its people as merchandise. They can be shipyard workers, they can be engineers, they can be sports trainers, they can be medical personnel. They couldn't care less. Okay, they are there only to provide a source of revenue for the regime. We need to be very clear about that. Okay, you mentioned the Nobel Prize. If you were going to give the Nobel Prize to the Cuban doctors, give the Nobel Prize to those that have defected, those that served, and those that had the courage to denounce the human rights violation. Don't give the Nobel Prize to the organization that enslaves, uses, and abuses these human beings.
So what about, that's another area, since your expertise in security, you haven't been mentioned this, and probably we are just including another topic here. Cuba, we know as a fact that Venezuela has been involved in the government of Maduro, has been involved in drug trafficking and money laundering, and they have an operation there of the cartels and the labs, and this is a major drug trafficking business in Venezuela, illegal drug trafficking. But since the regime from Cuba, the regime of Venezuela are so close, so that means that the Cuban regime is involved also in drug trafficking and money laundering?
As I mentioned before, the answer to that is yes, but let's again provide the historical context. I described the beginning, the genesis of this in the alliance between Roberto Suarez and Fidel Castro. Then how that continued with the alliance with Fidel Castro and the Colombian cartels. Then you need to realize that there was the alliance between the Cuban regime and the FARC. And then sadly for Venezuela, the advent of Hugo Chavez and how the Cubans convinced Chavez that this was a weapon. This was the weapon, the only weapon of strategic proportions able to damage, to defeat the United States. And then they transfer all this expertise. You don't have to believe me. Just check all the records from Causa Número Uno and Causa Número Dos, which was basically the execution of the biggest military hero of Cuban modern history, General Ochoa, and the chief of the Departamento de Divisas Extranjeras, then high-ranking military officer Tony de la Guardia, because the DEA discovered how deeply the Cuban government was involved in cocaine trafficking. What they did is that they outsourced their operations to Venezuela. And here's the supreme irony of this. A country with the largest oil reserves in the world all of a sudden becomes a drug trafficking hub with global outreach. And then you have organizations that never dreamed to enter the Western Hemisphere operating in our shores. You have Hezbollah, you have ISIS, you have Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, you have Al-Shabaab, Lashkar-e-Taiba, you have foreign powers hostile to the United States like Iran, China, and Russia, able to operate because these huge business, don't take my word again, check CNN's Nick Patton's great report that proved that last year alone, coming out of Venezuela, FARC cocaine to the amount of 240 metric tons reached the United States. The value of that amount of cocaine was calculated by this journalist at 39.2 billion. Can you imagine what can be done by all these criminal organizations, terrorist organizations, hostile intelligence services with that kind of money at your disposal? And that's just the operation of what we christen as Cubazuela, this hybrid between the know-how and the expertise of the Cubans with their global network and the ability of Venezuela to provide the cover because of all the oil revenue.
And that is a role from because the Cuban regime is Phoenician. They take advantage of everyone, manipulate everyone, including the Cuban people. But it's a role like a pimp, bringing these terrorists to the region and charging for the service. Same like China. Cuba helped China opening the door in Latin America and charged millions of dollars in donations from China because of that. And they did the same with Iran, and according to you, also with the terrorist group. It is more elaborated than that, so it is a brain behind all this operation, the Cuban regime, or just taking advantage of the major business and making profit. It's about profit, or it's about planning the whole thing?
It's a combination of both. It's a hybrid. It's a completely new animal. We have published a book on that, that's called Infinite War. It is, I don't know if it's ethical to recommend, you to read it because I'm one of the authors, but it describes exactly that. There is a completely new animal that combines the illicit activities, the transnational organized crime, with a political agenda that is able to perform social warfare. By the way, we are very concerned about certain symptoms in some of the events here in the US that were motivated by a tragedy. I'm talking the George Floyd case. That's a tragedy. There is no way to argue against that. But we saw, especially in South Florida, specifically in Miami, the presence of certain type of operators that had nothing to do with local grassroots movements. They had nothing to do with the grievances that were being expressed by the protesters, and were operating in solid tactical way, provided with a lot of money, and were coordinating things that ended in some of the most violent events in Miami. That's something that we are following closely, because it would be the first time that this hybrid have been able to operate inside of the United States.
No, and we have to think about if they're really the leaders are really looking for better justice and really fighting for the rights of everyone, or like Podemos in Spain. They were fighting and then they got into the government, and that was the end of the story of their social struggle. So I have another, we only have a few minutes left, and there's one call for the future. What are your thoughts about future of Cuba? When Cuba will be free of this barbaric dictatorship? What do we need to do, and how we can support Cuba to be free?
Well, first and foremost, and this is part maybe, all of us, we are the result of our education and our background and environment. I have a degree, in economic sciences that have been always being a good tool for me to perform political analysis. This is probably the lowest point that the Cuban regime have faced in history. As per the documents that we have seen, this is even worse than the Periodo Especial, okay? Mm-hmm. So this is the moment where the last and the worst thing you can do to the Cuban people is to give the regime a chance, give them oxygen. Because if you do that, you are actually favoring those that oppress, kill, torture, maim, traffic, attack, and violate every democratic principle that is cherished by Western societies. So, regardless of the political environment in the United States, I would say that in order to allow Cubans to be free, you need to stop pandering and facilitating the financial operations of the regime. If you do that using the excuse that the only people that is hurt is the Cuban people, no, that's not the case. No activities performed by the regime, the Cuban medical missions, all these technical missions, all these schemes of solidarity, not a dime is invested in the well-being and the progress of the Cuban people.
Yeah, it is something that continue the pressure with because of the work of you, Maria Orlo, and other people that have been fighting, people in Congress like Marco Rubio, but also Menendez. So we have a bipartisan approach to this fight. And my hope is that the next administration, if it's Trump re-elected or if it's Biden and whoever continue this, whoever wins will continue this battle. Do you see that's possible that anyone who win the presidency will continue this, having all this proof in front of us?
Well, again, evidence, facts, and proof have already been reflected in the State Department report. Okay. So there is no way that any administration, if it's a continuation of the Trump administration, if it's the advent of a Biden's administration, is going to be able to deny that. It's already carved in stone and expressed in an official report penned by the United States State Department. I hope that the ideological agenda and the mistakes that have been made, and I'm not saying that they were made only by Republicans or Democrats, could be corrected, because I think that this hemisphere has never seen a closer, more evident opportunity to bring freedom and democracy to Cuba in history. And I really hope that that goes beyond any kind, again, of partisan or ideological agenda.
Well, thank you very much, Hugo. It has been an interesting program, very informative. Your knowledge about security and human trafficking behind the Cuban doctors show us that you are in the right track, and we have good people fighting this fight. Thank you very much for being with us today and for participating in this program. In name of the Victims of Calmness Memorial Foundation, we are excited about the opportunity to bring more information and they contribute to that. to keep the pressure against this terrible regime and looking for freedom for the Cubans, that they need that freedom. So thank you very much, Hugo, and keep the good work. And to all of you, thank you for being here today.
Thanks a lot. It's been a privilege.